Jared has extensive experience directing and organizing issue-specific campaigns. He has worked on issues ranging from stopping the routine use of antibiotics on factory farms to lobbying state legislators for campaign finance reform. Most recently, Jared has directed Acterra policy campaigns on expanding access to EV charging, building electrification, and food system reform.
Woo! Thanks for the introduction, and now I'll share my screen. So let me know if you're seeing the slideshow all right.
Yep.
Great. So thank you all for coming. Really excited to talk to you all today about the lessons I've learned working with Acterra and the EV Charging Access for All Coalition, trying to achieve charging equity in the field. I don't need to really go too much detail about myself. Just to round things out, I'm Acterra's Senior Manager of Policy and External Relations, and Acterra has been a strong advocate for climate solutions, trying to figure out how to mitigate emissions, both through food and agriculture, through electrifying buildings, and transition away from gas vehicles to electric vehicles. So today we'll be focusing on electric vehicles, and we'll start by discussing the equity concerns. There we go. Equity concerns that drive our work. Then we'll go into some of the basics around EV charging for those who might be newer to the topic. And after that, we'll talk about policy recommendations and analysis of our policy proposals. And lastly, we'll be talking, before we go into questions, about some political tips and pitfalls from our campaign process. So let's dive into those equity concerns. The cheapest and most convenient place to charge an EV is at home. Consumer Reports has published reports documenting that there's substantial cost savings from EV driving. However, the reporting makes two things very clear. These savings are only for those who charge at home, and we'll get into the reasons why a little later in the presentation. And second, without access to charging, drivers are much less likely to give up their gas cars. As you can see in this chart representing the charging preferences of residents in the UK, about 60% of folks charge at home, and other 30% mainly charge at their place of work. So about 10% of EV chargers depend on en route and destination charging to meet their charging needs. And the way we think about this issue, as Andrea Colomima from Green Latinos puts it, limiting access to private charging in the 21st century is equivalent to the cold water flats that landlords were able to do. Unfortunately, back in the day, landlords were not required to put hot water into buildings, and without requirements from law, they had little incentive to do so, since they bore the cost, and many tenants didn't have a choice or a way to push these landlords to give them hot water. Cold water flats, or apartments without hot water, used to be common for low-income tenants. And just like building codes today require hot water in every unit, we need building codes to require access to power for charging for all multifamily units with access to parking. We need to retrofit existing buildings, of course, but we also need to stop making new buildings that just compound the problem. So we define equity as making sure all units have access to parking with EV-ready access. Or let me restate that. All units with parking have access to EV-ready charging. Making sure that parking space is distinguished with highly visible signage. Unfortunately, here in the Bay Area, there's been many cases where charging capacity, though not necessarily charging access, has been built in buildings with no signage. And because there's no signage, people literally have forgot that there's ability to install EV charging in their building. So signage is critical to, one, to show folks that charging is available and maybe that they should think about getting an EV because they might have access to charging. And two, for folks who don't actually have an EV, to know where they can charge their vehicle. And lastly, it's very important to make sure the unit is wired directly to the unit's meter. The parking space's charging is wired directly to the unit's meter whenever possible. The reason why this is so important is because the lowest cost charging is charging at utility rates. In California and probably many other states, when charging comes from a third-party supplier, that electricity is unregulated. So there is no price protections on the cost of that charging. So folks living in single-family homes, as we'll talk about a little later, who have access to these utility rates, will actually save more charging their electric vehicles than someone using that same electric vehicle in an apartment that is being served by a third-party supplier for their charging. So before we get into the numbers of our proposal, I think it would be good to just do a quick refresher for those who might not be familiar on the EV charging infrastructure lingo. So first, speed, talking about the speed of charging. There are three main levels folks talk about when we advocate, though we actually advocate mostly for low power level 2 charging, which is a variation of level 2. But first, level 1 charging is charging at your normal 112, 120 volt outlet. Actually, about 50% of EV chargers charge every day at level 1. It will typically fill up your battery overnight, charging at about 3 to 4 miles per hour of charging. Level 2 charging ranges from 10 to 20 miles per hour. So it's about 2 to 4 times faster than level 1 charging. And level 2 charging receptacles, which are oftentimes 220 volt outlets, are the same outlet that you use for stove or for your washing machine or dryer. And oftentimes EV drivers living in apartments will hook up their EV cables through their windows, out their apartments, or into their apartments to their dryer in order to get access to that level 2 charging. However, we have found that if folks have access to 1.8 kilowatts of charging, I forgot to mention that level 1 charging is about 1.4 kilowatts of power, and level 2 charging starts at 7.2 kilowatts per hour. But even at lower levels of charging, 5.2, 1.8, or 3.6 and 1.8 kilowatts of charging, what we call low power level 2, folks can meet their charging needs mostly in overnight charge. And then lastly, you have level 3, or what most call DC fast charging. The rate of power for DC fast charging range from 50 to 300 kilowatts and over, and you can charge 150 miles an hour of a charge. However, for older EVs, repeated fast charging cycles will wear the battery out quicker. And even more importantly, DC fast charging is more expensive to the end user than level 1 or level 2 charging. And additionally, if you have a parking garage with one level 3 DC fast charger, that will give folks less access than having every unit with access to parking have access to a level 1 outlet or access to low power level 2. So, so let's also talk a little bit about the types of EV charging access. So you have EV capable, which is just having access to the pre-wiring in order to charge your vehicle. We highly discourage folks from having a lot or any really EV capable infrastructure in their code. One, here in San Francisco, many cities have passed 10% or 20% of their charging access being EV capable, but I have not seen one of those EV capable spaces be actually turned into a space that's EV ready. And an EV ready space is a space where someone can actually charge their EV, and it's ready because it has a charging receptacle or it has a EVSE or electric charging station. As you see here, EVSE or electric charging station is a charging station where they actually have the hose, so someone doesn't have to bring their own charging equipment with them to charge.
Hey, Jared, a question
Yes.
from Jeffrey Perrone. Want to know any estimates of how much it would cost to install level 2 chargers for all units if built out at scale? Then Jeffrey's not being specific to new construction or retrofits, but thoughts on what's the cost of putting in charging stations?
Yeah, actually, we're going to get into that a little bit later in the presentation. And if I don't answer the question fully during the question and answer session, I can get back to it. If that's okay.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
But that's a really good question. And before we get into the question of cost, it's also important to stress why our proposal focuses on units rather than spaces. Typically, at least here in California, the commute is less than 40 miles a day for an EV driver. So it's much more important to make sure they have a place to charge every night and a place to charge when they need electricity, as opposed to making sure that receptacle or that charging station is at a high power. So let's say, for example, you have a 40 unit or a 20 unit building with 40 parking spaces, and the code for your state says 10% of them have to be electrified. Well, if that's the case, and let's say those 20 folks have EVs, only 4 of them can charge at one time. So for all of them to be able to charge, you either have to have some type of schedule where people switch when they're going to be charging, or some type of communication system so people can tell folks when they're free and have limitations on how long you can charge. It just adds extra hassle that's going to make people not want to get an EV. It's much better to use lower power or share that power between multiple spaces. So for example, if you had a level 2, or you have enough power to charge one level 2 charger and had on a bollard and could split that into 4 different spaces, if one person was using that, they could get the full 7.2 kilowatts of level 2 charging. If 2 people came, the second person can use that second hose or that second outlet if you have a bollard with 4 receptacles attached to it, and they can both get 3.6 kilowatts of charging. Or if 4 people come up, they all can get enough charging to be able to charge their vehicle overnight at 1.8 kilowatts an hour. So that's a better approach to charging or providing charging access to a building, as opposed to having one DC fast charger that everyone has to use and share. So our proposal advocates that all units with access to parking get EV-ready access in new construction to a low power level 2 space. We are definitely not against level 1, but we do recommend low power level 2. We also recommend reducing requirements for EVSE and power. I believe under our proposal, and charging outlet would cost about $1,500, as opposed to EVSE that can be twice as much as that. And I'll go into a little bit more about the importance of having ubiquity over power and when it comes to charging costs. And then lastly, we want to make sure that whenever possible, you wire to the unit's meter. And as I mentioned before, the reason why this is so important is because if you wire the space directly to the unit's meter, they will have access to those utility rates, and you don't have to add other meters that would add administration costs. Now, there's ways to do get everyone access to parking, even if you can't access the unit's meter directly, because you have a detached parking situation or some other type of technical barrier. But there shouldn't be any technical barriers that disallow you from making sure every unit that has access to parking has electrified space. And when it comes to costs as a function of the total construction cost of the building, This chart shows that in orange is what the current cost of putting in electric charging for about 10% of spaces according to, I guess the previous code from California. The blue is actually the new code from California where builders would have to electrify with different levels of access, 40% of spaces in a multifamily building. Now you see that their proposals from the state and our low power level 2 proposal are all just a tiny percentage of your overall building costs, about 0.2% of your overall building costs, or 0.27% of your overall building costs will be devoted to EV charging. And for a comparison, for an apartment building, about 3% of your building costs will be devoted to HVAC. So 30 times as much money will be devoted to HVAC as towards charging or giving charging access to every unit as access to parking. And one of the reasons why it's really important to try to put charging access in new buildings and avoid retrofitting is because we have a lot of data around how much retrofitting costs. For a 15-unit building, our low power level 2 proposal costs about actually $1,400 per port or per parking space when giving access. If you did it at level 1, that would be even cheaper. But if you try to retrofit that space with a similar level of power, estimates show that it could cost anywhere around $4,000 to real world actual costs from PG&E of $18,000 per port. So there's massive cost savings from making sure you install your charging when the building is being built, as opposed to having to retrofit charging afterwards and putting wiring afterwards in the building. And another reason why we advocate making sure all new multifamily buildings get access to charging is because in states like California, single family homes have had this access since 2015. And if you calculate the money saved from or by EV drivers or by folks who have switched from gas cars to EV cars in single family homes since 2015, they have saved around $11 billion. And that same group in multifamily homes have saved about $2.5 billion. So single family homes been able to garner an extra $9 billion in savings just because California law has mandated they have access to charging at utility rates. In our proposal, which was developed by engineers from Peninsula Clean Energy and Silicon Valley Clean Energy, has been adopted in part or the whole ordinance has been adopted by 18 or at least 18 cities in California. The number is higher now. And here's a showing of some of the cities that have adopted REACH codes like Oakland, San Francisco, Los Altos, Palo Alto, naming a few. And the coalition working with us pushing for this policy is pretty diverse. There's 99 organizations, 700 faith communities, 600 companies, 650 individuals working on creating code, doing outreach, talking to legislators, as well as relationships with labor and the business community. And then to end this off, I want to talk through tips and pitfalls from our working to try to pass this policy both at the local level and at the state level. So first, and this is one that we feel we probably need to put more effort into, we developed a policy that we could make a very strong argument did not hamper our ability to build more housing. Here in California and probably in many other states as well, the housing crisis is real, and we're very, very cognizant about increasing housing costs. And one of the reasons why we are pitching our proposal so hard is because, at least through our modeling for the 200 building use case the California uses for their building code, actually using a low power level 2 approach, charging 100% of spaces with access to power, is cheaper than the state's approach of trying to have level 2 charging to 40% of spaces and EV capable charging to about 10% of spaces in that same 200 building use case. But even though we've been able to show through data that our approach oftentimes is cheaper than what's currently on the books or currently proposed to be on the books, we still got pushback about how going to 100% is going to harm our ability to have enough affordable housing. So we needed more affordable housing stakeholders to say what we know and have a different voice to that argument that might have resonated more with folks at the state level. We had a bill, SB 1482, that passed through the House, not the House, the California Assembly, and the state Senate, telling the California state agencies to study how to get 100% of units in apartment buildings and condos that have parking access to charging. And that veto, unfortunately, today was vetoed by the governor. However, we have had a lot of success at the local level and, pushing the state agencies to move from 10% of parking spaces being covered to 40% of parking spaces being covered by building relationships with members of the building community, the labor community, and speaking with rulemakers as often as we can. In fact, here in California, we're working with the California Building Industry Association to try to develop a code that we both can sign off on. And we've come very close to getting a code that we both agree on and have been able to show the building industry arguments around how our code gives them more flexibility. And in the long run, is better for them both cost-wise and in terms of constructing new buildings as simply as possible. Another thing to be aware of when working on these issues that may not be relevant when you first fill out your campaigns is that, at least here in California, and probably because it's an industry bias, will be in other states as well, industry bias driven by charging companies and by OEMs, is the bias towards higher powered charging. Even though folks are very cognizant about the costs of how charging and how it increases housing costs, for whatever reason, folks still prefer higher levels of charging, or at least they, at first glance, seem to prefer that even if it costs more. We do not. We feel that the most important thing is to make sure people have access to charging, because if you have, a few parking spaces with, level 2 or DC power charging, that can only serve the few people that can have those parking spaces. But you really need to drive this argument home, and we have made success in hoping to show folks the benefits of low power, and are showing or are gaining ground both at the state level and at the local level. But it was a battle that we had to be very cautious about, knowing when we're going into meetings, folks were biased to only really want to talk about solutions that have level 2 power at 7.2 kilowatts being the minimum. Also, there's just a lot of misconceptions in the charging space, and we had a lot of folks just having misconceptions about our particular policy. In particular, it probably took us 2 years to convince our opponents that we weren't advocating for every single space to be electrified, just every space with access to parking. Though outside of that, there are legitimate objections that you should be prepared for. We here have a team of technical experts and engineers that's been working on these, stretch use cases. For example, we have, figured out, what you would do in a detached parking situation in order to give residents access, or all the residents with parking access to charging, even if you can't connect it to their individual units meter. And as I mentioned earlier, there has not been a case that we have come across where it has not been possible in a cost-effective manner in new construction to make sure all buildings or all units with access to parking have one electrified parking space. And lastly, and maybe just as important as my first pitfall, is providing regulators with a model code or alternative compliance pathway as early as possible. Through our process, we always got in our proposals on time, but we have learned that on time is not enough, either because of incompetence, because folks actively are trying not to interact with the policy, or in some cases, maybe just flagrant, disregard of certain laws. We have seen that if you don't get our recommendations in the beginning of the process, before they start creating in their head their model codes, the agencies don't want to necessarily do much dramatic change. So, for example, we had our policy proposal sent to the HCD in April of 2021, as well as September of 2021, during their public comment periods for that 3-year code cycle. So they were put in on time with months for them to review them as potential ways to do the code. However, in December, when they had their final meeting, they told us we did not give them enough time to review the code, even though we put in the code during their normal public comment period. We don't know how legally they can give us an answer like that, but regardless, in this code cycle, we made sure like the first, second month of the code cycle, we had model code in front of them so they can either tell us what they don't like about our model code, or they might even incorporate some of it in their process because it's earlier on. So we've learned that just because something gets to them before their comment deadline doesn't mean they're actually going to interact with it. And it's much better to get things in as early as possible when it comes to influencing policymakers, particularly at the state level. So any questions now that I didn't address?
Well done! Yay! You have so many comments and questions here. This place is on fire over in the chat. So Philip Lee asked, what is the biggest barrier to retrofitting level 1, 2 to every spot in every apartment? Is it labor availability, supply chain? I would include, ripping up the cement of the parking lot and then repaving it or putting in a new transformer. What do you see as the obstacles?
That second one is what I see as the biggest obstacle. My engineers would have a more technical answer, but those cost concerns around actually putting in wires or trenching or forbid that you have to do a panel upsizing, those are at least the issues I believe are making retrofitting so much harder, and a much harder issue to address in working with new construction. Acterra is going to be doing some more research in how to electrify existing buildings in this next fiscal year. But yeah, it's a very good question, and I believe that second issue is the primary one. But I definitely can pass that along to our engineers to give any more details if folks are interested.
Just to be clear, what you're saying, the second one is the trenching and the transformer, as opposed to labor or supply chain. It's not that it's not stuff, it's that it's just so expensive to put it in.
Yeah. Now there is supply chain issues in maintaining chargers as well. But I also there's also lots of unique, innovative ways to fill those workforce needs. So I feel there's ways to fill the workforce needs, but you need money to change and retrofit buildings. And if folks aren't willing or don't have that money, then that becomes an issue. So in new construction, where we can actually build these buildings and have a cost difference that's 0.03%, compared to what you would have paid for. That's one of the reasons why we just advocate for making sure it's done for new buildings and making sure we don't have these retrofit problems down the road or have less of them, because we're going to have them. We're going to have to figure out how and what different solutions we can to put charging in existing buildings, but we should not make that problem harder by building new buildings now without charging when we know people are going to switch to electric vehicles in the next decade or so.
Thank you so much, Jared. We are probably supposed to shift to the next presenter, but I'll just say I have, I think, at least 2 clients, affordable housing clients, who would show up and or write a letter or something that would support their prospective affordable housing that EVs work for them. Like they can do 100% charging and things like that. So just so you know, I want to be a resource for you on that one.
Oh, that would be great. We actually heard, not sure how true this is, but we did heard from the state legislature that our bill might have a better chance if it was directly towards affordable housing and not general, which seems counterintuitive. But yeah, getting more advocates like that, I think, would just make it so much easier for us to show our bona fides on equity, because we are very passionate about our solutions and how they reduce costs, not just to the building owner, but to the actual EV driver. And we feel that oftentimes that second piece isn't thought about enough. So it's we want to, you know, make sure, I feel like, you know, affordable housing groups also would really appreciate our focus on that half of the issue. And I think we can build some stronger coalitions if we have some more partners. So definitely love to have that connection.
All right. Thank you so much, Jared. Please go over to the chat and respond to people who are burning up the keyboards there. The keyboards.